Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are covering a serial killer who is so disturbing, and you've probably never heard of him as well. Because today we are covering Charles Albright, and back in the 90s, he was seemingly a normal man just going about living his life in Texas. But what people didn't realize is that he had a very dark, disturbing, twisted secret. He was obsessed with eyeballs. Yeah. And those were his trophies. So yeah, very disturbing, very sick and twisted. And this obsession with eyeballs started when he was a young child, and then it developed into this sexual fetish. And then when Charles was around 50 years old, he just decided all of a sudden that he wanted to remove the eyeballs from women to get his sexual kicks. I'm not joking there, like literally. Actual eyeballs, which is so disturbing to think about. And Charles Albright became one of the most disturbing serial killers that have come from Texas. And yeah, like I said, you probably never heard of him. So let's jump in. And I just want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, and that is Melan TV. And as you guys may have realized, I have been covering a lot of cases from the UK recently. There just seems to be so many horrific cases that are happening over here. And I wanted to recommend a documentary on Melan TV that I have been watching recently, which is called Killed Walking Home, which is all about horrific crimes that have happened in the UK. And the documentary focuses on violence committed every day, every year, against women. It is said that every 3 days a woman is killed in the UK. So that is mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, colleagues. And the documentary focuses on 3 very high profile cases that have happened in recent years in the UK. So that is Sarah Everard, Zara Alina, and Sabina Nessa. And every single one of those cases has actually been on my radar to possibly cover in the future. They are just so shocking because every single one of those women were killed when they were walking home. Something so simple, just walking down the street. And in the case of Sarah Everard, she was killed by a police officer, somebody that you are supposed to trust. And it begs the question, is it safe for women to just walk down the street in the UK? Like, can we even do that? And it's like, it's 2024. When is it going to be safe for women to just exist? And the documentary does a deep dive into those 3 cases, and I highly recommend it. And if you like documentaries, Melan TV is for you, because Melan TV have documentaries on every single genre. Also, Melan TV have one of the largest collections of true crime documentaries out there. So if you like true crime, I know you'll love Melan TV. And best of all, Melan TV are offering every single one of you a free 1-month free trial. So if you wanted to take advantage of that incredible offer, go to the link in my description box, which is try.melantv.com/Danielle Kirsty, and go and get your free 1-month free trial. Watch as many documentaries as you want. I know you'll be able to find a documentary that you love, and I highly recommend the documentary that I have been watching recently, Killed Walking Home. And using my link really does help out this channel because it lets Melan TV know that you came from this video. So thank you again to Melan TV for sponsoring today's video, but thank you to every single one of you watching right now, because truly without all of you guys, I wouldn't get opportunities like this. And now let's jump into today's case. Charles Albright was born on the 10th of August 1933, making him a Leo, and he grew up in Amarillo, Texas, where he lived with his parents, Fred and Dell. And Fred and Dell were not actually Charles's birth parents. He was adopted from an orphanage when he was just 3 weeks old. Now, to the outside world, Fred and Dell were amazing parents. However, that was not the case behind closed doors, because his adoptive mom, Dell, was an absolute nightmare. She took everything to the extreme. But in her mind, she was doing Charles a favor. Like, in her mind, she was the best mother anyone could be. So a couple of examples for you. If Charles needed to go for a nap, like when he's a toddler, a young child, he's going for a nap. But if Charles didn't want to nap, his mom would tie him to a bed with rope. If Charles didn't drink his milk to become a strong boy, he would be spanked and beaten. If Charles didn't do what he was told, he would be locked in a dark room for hours and until he learned his lesson. And those are just a couple of examples, and Dell justified this behavior because she thought that it would mold Charles into the perfect son. She truly didn't see anything wrong with what she was doing. But not just that, Charles's mom, Dell, was a hypochondriac. She was terrified of germs and she projected that fear onto Charles. And again, because of who she is, she did this in the most extreme ways. If Charles wanted to play in the back garden, he would actually be tied to a piece of rope so he wouldn't reach the dirt, because you know, dirt, germs, can't be having that. Charles would also have his clothes changed multiple times a day just to make sure that there wasn't a speck of dirt on them. He was only allowed to drink goat's milk, not any other milk, like cow's milk or anything like that. And I don't know why. Like, is goat's milk supposed to be better for you? Does it have less germs in it or something? I just don't know. But she kept a goat, her very own goat, in the back garden for this purpose. She also banned Charles from sitting on toilet seats in public because she told Charles that if he did, he would catch crabs. So Charles actually developed a lifelong phobia of toilet seats in general, which meant that he always hovered over the toilet seat and he never sat on a toilet seat. Another thing that Charles's mom made him do, and I just think that this is so sick, is that she would make Charles go to a hospital on a regular basis to visit patients that were dying. And she would say to Charles that if he didn't stay away from like dirt and germs and stuff like that, that is where he would end up. And it's like, wow, how can you do that to a child? How much would that mess a child up, play on their mind? And of course, Charles was left absolutely traumatized by all of this. But Dell didn't care. The ends justified the means, and the ends to Dell was that she was molding Charles into the perfect son and into the perfect human. So to say that Charles's mom was overbearing and controlled every single element of Charles's life would be an understatement. And this is now when we move on to a very significant thing in today's case. And that would be Charles's obsession with taxidermy. And taxidermy, if you don't know, is the thing that you do when you want to preserve an animal's body. So you preserve the body and you stuff them and you put them on display. And this obsession started when Charles was 11 years old. His mom bought him his first gun and she took him out hunting, which I'm like, wow, that is so out of character, because is he allowed like in a forest or wherever you go hunting? Like, is he allowed on dirt? And hunting an animal, like, I'm sorry, that's germs. And Charles would go out and he would start shooting animals and he would bring them back to his house. And I'm like, germs? Hello, dead animals equals bacteria, germs, whatever. I can't believe Dell allowed this to happen. And this is when Charles decided that he wanted to keep the animals that he had killed. He wanted to stuff them and put them on display. And this is when his mom taught him all about taxidermy. And this is something that they really bonded over. Dell would bring pigeons into the home in cages. She would hand them to Charles one at a time and show him how to kill these pigeons. And then after these pigeons were dead, she would hand Charles a knife and show him how to cut into their skull. And then Charles would use a spoon to remove all of the organs and the brain matter before his mom would show him how to pop the eyeballs out. And I'm really sorry for going into detail about that, but it's significant to this case. This is where Charles's obsession began with eyeballs. He found this incredibly satisfying, especially removing the eyes, and he would carry this feeling with him for the rest of his life. And I can't help but think that his obsession began because this was something that he bonded with his mom over. Like, his mom has treated him terribly his whole life. This is probably one of only a few positive experiences that Charles has had with his mom. And I can't help but think, is that the reason why this obsession began? Because he associates such positive memories and feelings with taxidermy, with popping eyeballs out. So normally in taxidermy, after you've removed the eyeballs, you would go to a shop, a specialized shop, and you would buy fake glass eyeballs that look real. And then that is what you would use to put onto the animal. And Charles would visit these shops with his mom. He would be fascinated by all of these glass eyeballs. He would be mesmerized about how realistic they looked. but they were expensive. And Dell was very frugal, and she never allowed her son to purchase any of these glass eyeballs. Instead, he would just have to use old buttons for eyeballs on his animals. And it was something that he really hated because he felt like just using old buttons made the animals look blind, and it also made them have no personality. And this is something that Charles was infuriated by, and he built up quite a lot of resentment towards his mom, towards this whole thing, because he wasn't allowed to buy these expensive glass eyeballs. So now Charles is moving on to his teenage years, and he has developed into a very angry teenager. He has a lot of built up frustration, and a lot of this was down to his mom. His mom would push him so hard to achieve at school. She would force Charles to practice the piano for hours every day. And then after he got back from school, he was forced for hours to practice reading, writing, any schoolwork. He had to just be the best at everything, and he was extremely intelligent. So much so, he actually skipped 2 grades. However, because Charles's mom was just pushing him way too hard, he eventually snapped and he decided to completely rebel. He became the class joker, the one that was always pulling pranks, trying to make people laugh, disturbing the class at every moment he could. He became incredibly popular. He started to become very, very confident. He basically went around the school like he ruled it. He would start destroying things in classrooms. He started stealing from teachers. There was even one time where he set his teacher's dress on fire. There was another time where he took a pair of scissors and cut a chunk of a girl's ponytail off. And it's like, what? Like, you would think that he would get detention or be suspended in some kind of way, just be punished somehow. But he wasn't. And this is very important to note because Charles just seemed to get away with everything. And it was either because he was so charming that he was able to talk his way out of everything, or because his mom Dell thought that the sun shined out of his arse and would come running up to the school professing his innocence. His mom was his biggest enabler. She really would go around acting like her son was an angel. And this is where Charles really did learn that he could get away with everything. And something else that would play a big part in Charles becoming who he becomes is his attitude towards sex. When Charles entered his teenage years, when he was going through puberty, his mom would tell him over and over again that she did not want Charles to end up like his dad. And according to Dell, his dad was a sex pest, that he was greedy, that he was demanding, that whenever he saw his wife in her underwear in the bedroom, he would literally just run at her and grab her and expect sex. And this is not something that any teenager wants to hear from their parents. Like, you don't want to know things like that. So this was incredibly disturbing and upsetting for Charles anyway. But Charles has a very complicated relationship with his mom and how he wants to please her. So Dell literally forbid him from acting like this with girls and acting on his urges. There was a couple of times where Charles did go on a date with a girl, but his mom was there the whole time. And Charles was always forced to leave the date early so he could be in bed by 8 o'clock. So Charles was raised to see girls and sex as wrong, as dirty, as something that he should not participate in. And this definitely led him to have a very unhealthy outlook on what sex is. And then finally, when Charles was 16, he graduated from high school because, don't remember, he skipped forward 2 grades because he's that intelligent, and he moved out of his family home for the very first time, and he went to college in Texas. And this is the first time that he was away from his overbearing mom. So it's no surprise to anyone that he went crazy. He went a bit off the rails. First of all, he got involved in a ton of criminal activity. He even decided to lose his virginity to a sex worker, and this is very significant. And this whole him losing his virginity to a sex worker was actually a dare from his group of friends that he had. Charles didn't actually want to do this, but he went through with the dare, but it completely messed him up. He felt incredibly guilty for what he has done. He felt conflicted because of how his mom has raised him to view sex. He also felt like he had let his mom down by doing this. So because he had all of these conflicting feelings about sex, about losing his virginity, especially to a sex worker, he grew to resent sex workers. And this was a lifelong resentment, which is important to this case. And then just a few months into his freshman year at college, Charles was arrested after stealing hundreds of dollars worth of goods from a local store. He was suspended from college and he had to go to court for his trial, where his mom turned up trying to be the savior. She actually begged the court to send her to prison instead of her son, but of course that didn't work, and Charles was sentenced to 1 year in prison. So this time he didn't get away with everything, did he? This was probably the first time that he was actually held accountable for something that he's done. So there's not really much to know about Charles in prison. He just kind of kept his head down. Then he was released from prison. He's now 18 years old and he goes back to college, and again he's an absolute nightmare. He never tried in classes. He was always fooling around, playing pranks again. He became the popular kid, which gave him a huge boost to his ego. A lot of people would say how good looking he was, and he carried on with his petty crime, and he entered into his first serious relationship with a girl called Betty. But there was one thing that came back up during his college years, and that was his obsession with eyeballs. He had not gotten over his childhood obsession and trauma, so because of this, Charles would regularly take his friends out to the woods. He would catch animals, kill them, and show his friends how to pop out their eyeballs. Yeah, I'm not kidding there, and I'm surprised he even had any friends after doing that. There was one time where he literally just picked up a frog and wrapped his fingers so tightly around the frog's head that the frog's eyeballs actually just popped out, which is just so horrific and cruel. Like, why is Charles doing this to animals? It's even said that Charles had jars of animals' eyeballs just in his dorm room. And then in another very twisted prank that Charles did was that his roommate broke up with his girlfriend. So Charles decided to take like 1,000,000 pictures of his friend's ex-girlfriend and cut out her eyes from all of the photos. And then he got the eyes that he cut out and he stuck them all over his roommate's side of the room. So there was literally just pairs of eyes everywhere. And then his roommate got a new girlfriend. So then Charles took the eyeballs from his ex-girlfriend and stuck those eyeballs onto pictures of his new girlfriend. It's just so weird, and his roommate was so freaked out about this. I would have asked to move rooms. I would not want to be in the room with Charles Albright. No, no, no. And then a few months later, Charles got kicked out of college once again because he was still stealing things left, right, and center, and he was caught stealing aquariums from his college. And I'm like, who the hell steals aquariums? Very random. And my mind went to, hang on a minute, does he want these aquariums to store all of his eyeballs? So he was kicked out of college. He avoided prison this time because the college were apparently too embarrassed to press charges. So instead, Charles just left college. He settled down with his girlfriend that he got in college, which was Betty. They soon got married and had a daughter together. And then 10 years pass and nothing really significant happens in Charles's life. However, when Charles reaches his 30s, this is when a lot of things happen pretty much at the same time. The first thing that happens is that he finds out that he was adopted. And this really messed with his head. And even though his adoptive parents wouldn't tell him anything about his biological parents, Charles became convinced that his birth mother was a sex worker. Now, don't ask me why he landed on this, but he has a resentment towards sex workers, and I think that is just why he landed on that, because he resents his birth mom for giving him up for adoption, and he resents sex workers, so he just put the two and two together. The next thing that happens to Charles is that he decides to get a divorce because he's bored of his wife and he's bored of being a dad. Been there, done that, don't want to do that anymore. So he completely abandons his ex-wife and his daughter, moves to another town, doesn't have anything to do with his daughter from this moment on, and he starts sleeping around with a load of different women. He also became an artist where he would get people to pay him so he could draw portraits of their face, but in particular, their eyes. Oh yes, his incredibly creepy obsession with eyes continues because that is what he wanted to draw. On top of that, because Charles is completely bored with his life, he decides to create a fraudulent degree certificate. Because remember, he was kicked out of college twice, never finished his degree. Well, you know what? He can't be bothered to go back to college and actually earn it the proper way. He's just going to forge one. So Charles got his fake degree certificate, and unbelievably it worked, and he manages to get a job at a high school. It's like, how does he get away with this? So he starts this job, and he's obviously a complete fraud, and annoyingly, he's very successful because he's so bloody intelligent that he can literally do anything. So he's a really good teacher. All the students, all of the fellow faculty love him. However, it was eventually discovered that he was a fraud, so he was fired. And then he moved on to the most random collection of jobs I think I've ever heard of one person doing. He became, at one point, a hairdresser. Then he moved on and became an aerospace designer. And then he became a bullfighter. Yeah. It's like, who the hell becomes a hairdresser, then a bullfighter, an aerospace designer? He was a teacher. What the hell? And it actually sounds like a joke, doesn't it? Like, seriously, a hairdresser, an aerospace designer, and a bullfighter all walk into a bar. So Charles is now approaching his 50s, and this is a pinnacle moment in his life because his adoptive mom, Dell, passed away. And this would change everything for Charles. And when Dell passed away, it was very sudden, not expected. And Charles was left absolutely devastated. And he completely went off the rails. And this really was the trigger for Charles. He started to get really angry again about his biological mom. It started bringing up a lot of those unresolved feelings for him. He started to make very rude comments about sex workers to his colleagues, to any of his friends. He would say that he hated them with a passion. He would say that he wanted to kill them all. And this is when Charles, seemingly out of the blue, decided to commit a horrific sex crime against a 9-year-old child. So a few months after his mom passed away, Charles started to attend church. He found that it really helped him during his grief, and Charles befriended a 9-year-old girl. He would start going to her parents' house all the time. He would buy her gifts, try to butter her up. And then one day when Charles was alone in her house with the 9-year-old girl, he sexually assaulted her, which is just so awful and horrific. This man is a monster. That poor 9-year-old girl. And I just think, thank God, he doesn't have anything to do with his daughter, if that is the kind of person he is. Now, thankfully, he was caught for doing this. The parents pressed charges, and Charles decided to plead guilty. And for his crimes, the sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl, he was sentenced to 10 years of probation. Yeah, not 10 years in prison, 10 years probation for a sex crime against a child. And he's already been to prison. He is a repeated offender. Why the hell has he been given probation? That just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So Charles, in his mind, he's basically gotten away with sexually assaulting a child. That is what the criminal justice system has basically told him, that it is okay to sexually assault a child because you'll just get 10 years probation, no harm, no foul. So after this horrific crime, Charles moved on with his life. I'm sure the 9-year-old girl didn't, but Charles moved on. He met a new woman who went by the name Dixie, and they got married, started a new life together. However, did Charles respect his wife? No. Because as soon as they were married and moved in together, Charles started visiting sex workers on a regular basis. His trauma and toxic views towards sex and sex workers definitely wasn't behind him, but he was now visiting them and using their services over and over again. He began to make frequent trips to the Dallas red light district. He became a familiar face. The sex workers of the local area started to recognize him. And in the beginning, when he was visiting sex workers, all of the sex workers would say how nice he was. He was very kind to the sex workers. He would give them more money. He would buy them a hot meal. He would buy them gifts. And I can't help but think that he was just doing this to butter them up, to make them trust him. And his wife had no idea that he was visiting sex workers multiple times a week. Charles, as a cover story, just said to his wife that he was going out on a paper round at night, and she bought it. Charles didn't have a job at this point, by the way. He was just living off his wife's money and getting them both into a lot of debt. So he's really just great all round, isn't he? So like I said, initially he was Mr. Nice Guy to the sex workers that he was visiting, but that act didn't last for long, because as time passed, as the sex workers that he was using became more comfortable around him, he started to become incredibly violent towards them, and he wanted very rough, violent sex that he didn't ask consent for prior. He would beat sex workers as they performed oral sex on him. There was also a time where he took 2 sex workers at the same time back to a motel room and tied them both to a bed. And again, my mind was like, is that something to do with his childhood trauma? Because obviously he was tied to a bed when he was younger. So he has these 2 sex workers tied to a bed. And I also want to point out that they didn't consent to this. This was not agreed beforehand that this was okay. He pulls out his belt and an extension cord, and he just starts whipping both of these women, and he starts shouting at them, "Scream, bitch, I know you like it." Again, I can't help but think, was this something that his mom did to him, like when he was tied to a bed? Because we know that she did used to beat and whip him when he didn't do what he was told. And these 2 sex workers, they were obviously traumatized, so scared, but Charles didn't let up. He believed that because he was paying these women, that he was in control of them and he could do whatever he wanted, and they just had to deal with it because they were being paid. So if being violent and beating up sex workers and basically sexually assaulting them because they hadn't consented to this prior, if that wasn't bad enough, Charles started to groom a young teenager at the local mall. And don't ask me how he first met this teenage girl, because I don't know. All I know is that he would visit this mall every single day, and he would put the charm on, and he would buy this girl gifts, shower her with loads of compliments, made her feel good about herself. And then Charles, this 50-something-year-old man, managed to manipulate this teenage girl into having sex with him regularly. Again, this is not like consensual at all. She's a teenage girl, and I don't know how old this teenager was. I don't know if she was over the age of consent, but I don't care. He has manipulated and groomed her. This is wrong on so many levels. And because this teenager was so vulnerable, Charles soon realized that he could carry out his violent sexual tendencies on this teenage girl with no repercussions. And this teenage girl soon realized that Charles had a sexual fetish for X-Acto knives and eyeballs. So yes, this is where the eyeballs come back up. And this is all Charles would talk about to this teenager. Eyeballs, eyeballs, eyeballs. He would also show this teenager his collection of X-Acto knives. And he would tell this girl, using these knives, exactly how he would remove the eyeballs from animals. And all of this talk about removing eyeballs and just eyeballs in general would turn Charles on so much that he would demand sex after. And this teenage girl was so terrified because she truly did believe that he was capable of killing her. And I also believe that all of this talk about removing eyeballs was quite threatening. Almost like Charles was saying, I will do this to you if you don't do as you're told. But thankfully, this teenage girl managed to escape this abusive relationship with Charles, and she managed to escape relatively unharmed. But Charles, he didn't really care that much. He was still visiting sex workers on a regular basis, carrying out his very violent fantasies with them, and his wife still had no clue. And at this point, Charles's personality really did start to change for the worst. And it's like, how much worse can it get? At this point in Charles's life, he was playing on a local softball team. And normally when he played softball, like, he was pretty level-headed, never really got too much into like competition, or he was never a sore loser. But now all of a sudden, he was incredibly angry and violent all of the time, wanting to start fights with people. And his teammates noticed that Charles kept bringing up sex workers over and over again. Every single conversation seemed to lead back to sex workers, and Charles would say over and over again just how much he hated sex workers. He wanted them all wiped from the planet, even though he was using their services multiple times a week. And his teammates kind of just brushed off these comments, even though Charles actually was expressing that he wanted to kill sex workers, they just brushed it off and was just like, oh, it's just Charles being Charles. Like, you know, he can be a bit weird. But Charles was not joking. And he is now about to go on a killing spree. Because on the 12th of December, 1990, Charles went out onto the Dallas red light district, which he so often did. And he picked up 2 sex workers by the name of Mary Pratt and Veronica Rodriguez. Mary was 33 years old. She'd had a tough life. She was struggling with a drug addiction and had fallen into sex work. And other than that, sadly, we don't know anything more about Mary's life. And it's a similar story with Veronica as well. Veronica was 26 years old and she also had a drug addiction. And on this evening, Charles picked up both women. He drove them to a secluded field. It was already dark, so no one could see anything. He pulled out a blanket, laid it down, and asked them both for sex. And both women agreed, so sexual activity started. However, at some point, out of nowhere, Charles violently attacked Veronica. He hit her over the head before raping her, and then he started viciously beating Veronica as if he wanted to kill her. Veronica was absolutely terrified. She was kicking and screaming, and she did manage to fight back. She managed to get free and she ran off. However, Mary was still there. She was paralyzed with fear. She didn't know what to do, and Charles pulled out a gun, pointed it at Mary, and shot her in the back of the head. And tragically, this is when 33-year-old Mary Pratt lost her life. And I need to warn you now, things do get quite graphic, because what is about to happen would become Charles Albright's signature move, what made him the Texas eyeball killer. Because this is when Charles pulled out his X-Acto knife and started to remove Mary's eyeballs. He started to dissect them from her body, just like he did during his taxidermy. He pushed his knife in before the eye popped out of the socket. He then severed the tissue that was attaching the eyeballs to Mary's head. And he did this with surgical precision. What Charles was doing, he was taking incredibly seriously. It was if it was a work of art to him. He spent almost an hour on this field doing this. And I think this tells you a lot about his character, because he has just killed an innocent woman in a field, and yes, it's secluded, but anyone could come across him, which tells you that he has zero fear that he is going to get caught. Either that, or he's just so desperate to remove the eyeballs that he really just doesn't care. But given the fact that he has gotten away with everything in his life, I think he thinks that he will get away with it. And once Charles had finished, he pocketed the eyeballs to keep for his own personal collection. And then Charles dragged Mary's body, placed her body in his car. He drove her right in the middle of a nearby neighborhood, which was a neighborhood near to where Charles lived. Charles then dragged Mary's body from the car out into the street. He removed her pants, lifted up her shirt to expose her breasts, and posed her basically completely nude for anyone to come across and see. And then Charles left, leaving Mary naked in the street. He had shut her eyelids so you couldn't tell that she had no eyeballs, but the way that he posed her, exposed her breasts and everything, he is trying to humiliate and degrade Mary even in death. That is how he views her, because he has no respect for sex workers at all. He hates them, and that is how he sees Mary. And when I was doing my research, I did come across an autopsy photo of Mary where you can see that her eyeballs have been removed, and I truly wish that I had never seen that photo, because it is one of the most disturbing photos I think I've ever seen in my life. I'm sure some of you will go and try and find it, but I would recommend that you don't. Like, seriously, just don't go and look for that photo. So the next morning, Mary's body was discovered by 2 teenagers, which would have been incredibly traumatizing for them to find Mary. Meanwhile, Veronica, she obviously fled from Charles, and I don't know if Charles planned on killing both of them that evening. I just don't know. But Veronica went straight to the police because she had fled before Mary had been murdered, so she had no idea what had happened to Mary. She went to the police, she was all frantic, and she started telling her story, but no one believed her. Apparently, Veronica had gained herself a little bit of a reputation for lying. On top of the fact that she was a sex worker and police never seemed to take sex workers seriously, they all just thought that this was another one of her stories, so they weren't going to believe her. And even if Veronica did have a reputation for telling lies, this time she was telling the truth, and it is the police's job to take every accusation seriously. So yes, there's technically nothing that could have been done to save Mary at this point, but if they had just listened to Veronica, they possibly could have saved future women from Charles. So then back at the scene of the crime where Mary's body has been dumped, obviously police are now on the scene, and those police officers have no idea about the story that Veronica is telling in the police station. Like, they just don't know. So no connection to Charles was ever made. And as well, because the victim, Mary, was a sex worker, police were just like, well, these things happen. This is what you get if you're a sex worker, so who really cares? So yes, they did investigate Mary's murder, but they didn't exactly try too hard. So Charles Albright, for right now, has gotten away with his first murder. So at this point, a couple of months pass. Charles goes into somewhat of a cool down period. He returns back to his normal life with his wife, doing his paper round, and he still visits sex workers frequently behind his wife's back. However, by the time we get to the 8th of February 1991, Charles is ready to strike again. Because on this evening, Charles goes back to the Dallas red light district and he picks up a sex worker by the name of Susan Peterson. And Susan was 27 years old, and she was actually one of the sex workers where Charles took back two sex workers to the motel room and tied them to a bed and viciously attacked them. She was one of those sex workers, so she knew how violent Charles was. However, on this evening, Susan got in the car with Charles and she went with him. And Charles went back to the same secluded field that he had taken Mary and Veronica to. He took out a blanket, he laid it on the floor and asked her to perform oral sex on him. And whilst Susan was performing oral sex on Charles, Charles took out a gun and shot her in her stomach. This caused Susan to fall backwards in agony, and Charles just stood over her, pointed his gun at her again and shot her in her chest. At this point, Susan was clinging to life, but Charles wanted to make sure that he got the job done. So this is when he took his gun again and shot her point blank in the head. And tragically, this is when 27-year-old Susan Peterson lost her life. And afterwards, Charles did the exact same thing to Susan that he did to Mary. He spent an hour on that field removing her eyeballs before pocketing them for his personal collection. He then took Susan's body, put her in his car, drove her to the same neighborhood that he dumped Mary's body in, and he posed Susan's body in the exact same way, less than a mile away from where he had posed Mary's body. Her pants were removed, her shirt was lifted up to expose her breasts. This time he also pulled out a clump of her hair and laid it on her chest. Don't really know why he did that or what that means, but it clearly means something to him. And of course, her eyeballs were missing. The next morning, Susan's body was found and it was reported to the police. It was found in broad daylight in the middle of a neighborhood, and I can guarantee you that Charles was loving this attention. It's very obvious by the way that Charles is posing the bodies and also where he is dumping the bodies that he wants the bodies to be found quickly. He could have quite easily left the bodies of his victims in the secluded field where he's killing them. But no, he wants to place them in a neighborhood where people live, where people will walk past the bodies. He wants that shock value of posing the bodies. And when the police discover Susan's body, there were just way too many similarities to Mary's body. The fact that they were both sex workers, the fact that they were both posed in the same way, the fact that both of them had their eyeballs removed, which is not exactly normal, and the police were like, oh no, we have a serial killer on our hands and we're now actually going to have to investigate these murders of sex workers. The FBI were brought in because they have more experience with things like this, and they went out and questioned a load of sex workers from the Dallas red light district, and quite a few sex workers mentioned Charles Albright, who was this weirdo man who had a violent side that was obsessed with X-Acto knives and eyeballs. So literally there was multiple sex workers that said Charles Albright. But for some strange reason, this information was completely ignored. And I'm like, what? You've literally got multiple people telling you to look into this man. Why the hell are you ignoring it? So for right now, Charles has now gotten away with his second murder. And guess what? Charles just keeps on going. This time his cooldown period is a lot shorter. He's becoming a lot more reckless, and just a few weeks later in March, Charles strikes again. This day he picked up 20-year-old sex worker Tina Connelly, and he was a regular client of Tina's. Charles took her out to the same field. He lay down his blanket. He asked for oral sex. And as she was giving him oral sex, he became very violent. He actually started ripping her hair out in clumps and just started throwing it on the ground. And then all of a sudden, Charles ran back to his car and started rummaging around in the glove box. And Tina was like, what is happening? And she could hear metal clanging on metal from like Charles in his car. And Tina was like, oh my God, he's gone to get a weapon. So Tina stood up and she ran for her life. And thankfully, she managed to escape Charles that day. Now, we don't know if Tina ever went to the police or not. I mean, she probably doesn't trust the police with how they treat sex workers, so we don't know. But if she did go to the police, she was ignored. And just 1 week later, Charles is at it again. He was furious that Tina had managed to get away. So this day, he picked up 37-year-old sex worker Brenda White. As Brenda got into the car, Charles told her that he was taking her to a nearby field. And Brenda said, no, that is not what I do. I see clients in a motel. Those were her rules. She went to a location that she knew. However, when she was saying this, Charles refused. He was like, no, I'm paying you, so I'm taking you to a field. And whilst Charles was still driving, Brenda had pepper spray in her bag and she pulled it out and sprayed it in Charles' face, opened the passenger side door and ran for her life. And thankfully, Brenda also managed to escape Charles that day. But again, we don't know if Brenda ever went to the police about this possible attack. Now, Charles was becoming incredibly infuriated at this point because 2 victims had gotten away from him. He could not wait any longer. I don't know if Charles actually wants to kill women or if he just wants their eyeballs, but either way, he needed to attack a woman again. So he goes out on the hunt just a few days later. However, this time, Charles's killing spree would finally come to an end. Because on the 19th of March 1991, Charles picked up 45-year-old sex worker Shirley Williams. Now again, we don't really know anything about Shirley's life. However, we do know that she had 2 adult children, an adult daughter and an adult son. And on this evening, Charles picked up Shirley and took her to the nearby field. The same field that he's taken all of his victims to. He laid out a blanket and he asked for oral sex. This time, Charles did things slightly different. He demanded Shirley remove all of her clothes before she performed oral sex, even though it was absolutely freezing outside. It was actually raining, which Shirley did. She then started to perform oral sex on Charles, but then Charles pulled out his gun and shot Shirley at point blank range in the head. And this is when Shirley Williams lost her life. However, after murdering Shirley, Charles realized that it was nearly morning. The sun was about to come up. Charles had taken too long to choose a victim that night and bring them to the field. Charles was definitely getting reckless. He wasn't following his same routine that he normally did. And normally at this point, after he has murdered a woman, he spends an hour removing their eyeballs. But Charles does not have the luxury of time right now because the sun is about to come up. However, he still needs to feed that need in him to remove Shirley's eyeballs. So without his usual surgical precision, he hacked at Shirley's face to remove her eyeballs. He removed them as fast as he possibly could. However, crucially, what Charles didn't realize was that with his sloppiness, he had left his X-Acto blade in Shirley's cheek. And after he had removed Shirley's eyeballs, he threw her body in the car. He drove her to a different neighborhood because his usual neighborhood that he likes to dump his victims in was too far away and he didn't have time to travel that far. And then he just dumped Shirley's body on the side of the road, not having time to pose her in his usual way. He still dumped her in a neighborhood though, where people would come across her body very quickly, and this is when Charles drove off, hoping that he would get away with murder just one more time. So Shirley's body was discovered very quickly. And even though her body wasn't posed and her eyeballs hadn't been removed with surgical precision, police still knew that it was the work of the same serial killer, because it's not exactly very common that a serial killer removes eyeballs. So the police finally realized that they needed to take this seriously. So they went back to the Dallas red light district and questioned as many sex workers as they possibly could. And one name kept coming up over and over again, and that was Charles Albright. And at around the same time, the police got a visit from Brenda White, who was the victim of Charles, who got the pepper spray out and sprayed it in his face and got away. Well, she came forward after Shirley's murder because she thought that maybe it was the same guy. And because Brenda came forward, she was able to pick out Charles Albright's face in a lineup. So this was finally enough evidence for the police to work with. Also, Veronica was brought back in for questioning. Now, if you remember, Veronica escaped Charles during his first murder of Mary, and she went to the police and they didn't take her seriously. Well, they've now brought Veronica back in for questioning, and they are finally taking Veronica seriously. And because Veronica knew Charles because he was a frequent client of hers, she was also able to pick out his face in a lineup. So the police finally go and arrest Charles Albright. And it is definitely frustrating because if they had just listened to Veronica in the first place, he would have been arrested a long time ago. So they take Charles in for questioning, and of course, he denies everything because Charles thinks that he's going to be able to get away with these murders. On top of that, his wife Dixie came in to defend her husband and gave him an alibi for every single murder and attack. So she's lying to the police. And it really is like Dixie is a reincarnation of Charles's mom, Dell, because Dell came to the defense of her son at every opportune moment. And now Dixie is doing the same thing. Dixie thinks that the sun shines out of Charles's ass. But the police needed more evidence. They only had 2 women pick Charles out of a lineup. They needed solid, concrete evidence. What they were really hoping to find were the victim's eyeballs. And because this was Charles's MO to remove the victim's eyeballs, these are clearly his trophies, police were convinced that he was keeping them in his home, or at least keeping them somewhere. However, the problem is that the police could not find the eyeballs. They searched everywhere, and the eyeballs were nowhere to be seen. The police also searched Charles's car, and this is when they found the blankets that he used to lay down and then have sex with the sex workers, and then obviously he murdered them. And on these blankets, they found hair and DNA belonging to all 3 murder victims. So they finally had some evidence linking Charles to the murdered women. However, I know you're probably thinking, well, great, case closed. But that is not the smoking gun that it should have been, because it was well known that Charles visited sex workers frequently. Even though his wife denied it, it was well known. So Charles could just play this off that these were just innocent encounters with the women. So the police still needed more evidence. So this is when Tina came forward. Tina was the victim that Charles had taken to the field, and then he went back to his car to try and find a weapon, and Tina ran for her life. Well, Tina came forward and she led the police to the field that he had taken her to. And this is also the field where Charles murdered the 3 women. And when they got to the field, they found the bloody clothes of Shirley Williams. Charles hadn't had time to clean up the crime scene and get rid of her clothes. And these clothes were also covered in Charles's DNA. So the police thought that this is finally enough evidence to link Charles to the murders. And Charles was charged with 3 counts of murder. Charles was also charged with a 4th murder of a woman called Rhonda Bowie. Her murder was actually before Mary's, so if he did kill Rhonda, Rhonda would actually be his first victim. However, her eyeballs hadn't been removed, and I don't know why they thought Charles was responsible for her murder, but the evidence wasn't strong enough to link him to the murder of Rhonda, so those charges were ultimately dropped. So a few months later, in late 1991, Charles went to trial, and he obviously pleaded not guilty because, you know, he thinks that he can charm everyone and get away with these murders. So throughout the whole trial, Charles told one story after another to try and charm and manipulate the jury into thinking that he was innocent. His wife Dixie also took the stand and said how amazing her husband was, that he was perfect, not capable of murder. And it turns out, annoyingly, things didn't work out too good for the prosecution because the only evidence linking Charles to the first two murders of Mary and Susan was their hair on the blanket, and the jury didn't think that this was strong enough to convict him of murder. So unbelievably, for the murders of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, Charles Albright was found not guilty. However, when it came to the third victim, Shirley Williams, they had her blood-soaked clothes with Charles's DNA on those clothes, and the jury found this much more convincing. So thankfully, Charles Albright was found guilty on the third murder of Shirley Williams, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So even though it is infuriating that he technically has only been found guilty of one murder, at least he was sentenced to life in prison and he will not be getting out. And as time went by, Charles in prison, he became an incredibly popular inmate. And that has been the case throughout his whole life. He's always been the popular kid, always been able to make a lot of friends, charm a lot of people, and he had a load of friends in the outside world that would come and visit him in prison. And Charles, throughout the whole time he was in prison, would say that he's innocent. And all of his friends still believed that he was innocent. And he appealed time and time again, but thankfully, all of his appeals failed and he remained behind bars for the rest of his life. And then on the 22nd of August 2020, Charles Albright died in prison from natural causes. And right to the very, very end, he pleaded his innocence. And the biggest mystery behind this case are the eyeballs, because they still haven't been found. I think it's safe to say that Charles kept the eyeballs, because why else would he spend so long removing them with such precision? And he clearly hid them somewhere, but they still haven't been found. And I just wonder, what was he planning with those eyeballs? And my mind immediately goes to taxidermy. Like, what was he planning to fulfill his sick and twisted fantasies? All we know is that Charles had a disgusting sexual fetish for eyeballs, and this drove him to murder 3 innocent women. And very sadly, we don't know much about the victims in today's case. I wish I could tell you more, but I'm going to end this video remembering their names. Mary Pratt was taken far too soon. She was just 33 years old. Susan Peterson was also taken far, far too soon. She was just 27 years old. And finally, Shirley Williams was a mother to an adult son and an adult daughter who greatly miss her. She was taken away from them far too soon. She was only 45 years old. So that brings us to the end of today's sick and twisted, disgusting case. As always, let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions, and don't forget to leave me your case suggestions in the comments down below, because I always want to know what you want to hear next. Thank you again to Melan TV for sponsoring today's video, and I'll see you all in my next one. Bye.